We have a problem to discuss, and it's about Latin education. You see that word? Congregationis or congregationis. Now, that's in the genitive case, but is that the second case, or does it come in another place? We're going to discuss that today. I'm Luke, and this is Polymathy. When we learn Latin, we have to memorize paradigms of nouns. For example, rosa, rosai, rosai, rosam, rosa. The singular of rose, you know that one. Now notice the order I did that in. Nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative. Now that's the order that's been used for both classical languages, Greek and Latin. The Greeks came up with it way back thousands of years ago. When the ancient Romans memorized the paradigms of their own language, as well as those of the ancient Greek language, that's the order that they did them in. And that's the order that most of us today still memorize the paradigms of Latin nouns and adjectives and pronouns. These paradigms of nouns are called declensions, from Latin declinatio, meaning going downhill. This is something we all have to commit to memory in order to be competent users of Latin and ancient Greek and other languages that have declensions. So what are these cases for exactly? Well, we actually still have the remnants of the Old English case system, a system about as highly inflected as that of Latin or ancient Greek, in the modern language, such as in our pronouns. Nominative, I am here. Genitive, my or mine. This is mine, of me. Dative, me. Give me that book. Me, to me. Accusative, me. You hear me. All nouns also take the genitive case, which regularly ends with an apostrophe s in the singular and s apostrophe in the plural. John's house is over there. The tree's color in autumn is splendid. We don't think of this as a separate case most of the time when we consider English grammar, due to the fact that the erstwhile Old English case system has since mostly collapsed, and thus it's not terribly useful or important to understand the structure or morphology of our language in terms of cases, when a simple idea like the possessive will do. But the case system is absolutely essential in modern languages like German, Polish, Ukrainian, among others, and equally as necessary to understand for the two classical languages, Latin and ancient Greek. Here are a few Latin examples to help you get the hang of cases. Nominative, feles esurit, the cat is hungry. Genitive, felis dentes acuti sunt, the cat's teeth are sharp. Notice the genitive in both the English and the Latin. Dative, feli cibundat vir, the man gives the cat food. Notice that the dative is fossilized in this English word order, but if we changed it, we would need the preposition to. The man gives food to the cat. Accusative, felem mulcet vir, the man pets the cat. Ablative, a fele vir amatur, the man is loved by the cat. As you can see, Latin word order is quite flexible. These sentences could have been arranged in almost any order, due to the clarity of relationships between the nouns provided by this highly inflected case system. While that's enough to summarize what Latin cases are for, if you really want to learn not just the cases but everything you need to understand about Latin grammar and vocabulary and pronunciation too, then I invite you to go on an exciting adventure with me and with the course I developed for StoryLearning, based around an original novella that I wrote, and it chronicles the adventure of a daring archaeologist, a genius physicist, and a tremulous philologist, 21st century explorers, and fluent Latin speakers on a quest for a lost relic from the Roman Empire. Now, the only way you can read this exciting tale is through my StoryLearning course, Latin Uncovered, Vir Petasātus, and it immerses you in the idiom of both classical and modern-day Latin, with a mystery that'll keep you guessing to the very end. Now, you know I espouse many different ways of learning Latin, so whom is this course for, and what makes it different? Well, some people are born autodidacts, and they can learn everything on their own as long as they have some books. Well, more power to them. Other people require the guidance of a teacher, either in a digital classroom or in person. But many others still, they would love to have the best of both worlds, a teacher that guides them every step of the way, but when they have free time, not when the teacher or the other students have free time. And that's why Latin Uncovered gives you exactly the right experience. You get the videos of me teaching you all you need to know about the core vocabulary, the grammar, the idiom of Latin, while enjoying an adventure story that I had a great deal of fun writing. And oh yeah, it comes with the most detailed pronunciation guide I've ever put together. As for the story, it's not a graded reader, and that's different from other books, but I did that by design, because I want to challenge you with a real adventure tale from the very first page. But don't worry, I'll be there for every single chapter to explain everything you need to know. Naturally, the novella is accompanied by my audiobook recordings of the whole book in both classical and ecclesiastical pronunciation. I teach you how to do both so you can choose what you want to learn. And there's an incredible 60% discount available for Black Friday, and you can access it by signing up today for Latin Uncovered at the link below. You know, they say that learning Latin is like climbing Parnassus, ascending a steep mountain. The course I made for StoryLearning is my guide to making your path to the summit much easier, and I think very enjoyable. And when you get to the top and see how far you've come, you'll know it was worth the journey. Climbing the figurative mountain of Parnassus, we eventually acquire the Latin language. A metaphor equally apt for the ancient Greek language, which has all the same cases as Latin, minus the ablative. Like I mentioned, it was the Greeks who originated the traditional order of nominative, genitive, dative, accusative. Interestingly, the Greeks and the Romans couldn't decide if the vocative deserved its own case. This makes sense since, in both languages, the vocative is much rarer than the other cases and, moreover, rarely differs from the nominative. Thus, it gets placed at the end of the paradigm, which I think is sensible. More on the vocative later. What order the cases are listed in may seem trivial, but this order is how we have to memorize every declension. Thus, it's worthwhile to analyze what reason exists, if any, for the received sequence of cases. Why the nominative first? Well, there seems universal agreement from antiquity to the present, even in the Nouveau order of the cases that I'll be discussing later, that nominative should come first since it's the case of the subject and the copula, and thus is considered by default as the principal identity of the noun or adjective. The order of the rest of the cases following the nominative, being genitive, dative, accusative, is not immediately obvious. So what rationale do the Greeks have for employing this order? In their 1979 paper, Allen and Brink make an excellent account of the ordering of cases through time, and determine the earliest record of a specific order is that given by Hellenistic grammarians like Dionysius Thrax, likely coming from the Stoics, such as Zeno. So the order may have existed since the classical Greek period. But why this order? Ancient grammarians and modern philologists have identified two rationales for the traditional sequence. Let's look at the first one. This one is called Localistic Theory, that a subject in the nominative case may come from a place, genitive, be in a place, dative, and then go to a place, accusative. Here are a few sentences in ancient Greek that demonstrate this principle. I'll be using the restored pronunciation of classical Attic. Puten haki, iktes attikes, genitive. Puestin, intoi korintoi estin, dative. Puiesin, epiten lakonian, accusative. While there's variety in the usage of prepositions and the cases, the general idea is that we have certain prepositions like apo, from, and ek, out from, that take the genitive and identify place of origin, while en, in, and epi, on, in the dative are used for when a subject is in a location or does something in that location. And finally, epi, upon, pros, towards, and eis, into, take the accusative case and are used for motion towards. Although this is a fine way to rationalize the traditional order in Greek, it doesn't necessarily work in Latin though, since no Latin prepositions go with the genitive. Allen and Brink even think that the term kasus genetius is actually a mistranslation of the Greek ptosis genike, averring that genike intends generic or general, and thus is not related to the generating or creating of anything. Yet the Latin calque, genetius, derived from gigno gignere, to give birth, is actually exceedingly apt, since Latin and Greek both use the genitive to convey parentage. Take the inscription on the Pantheon. Marcus Agrippa, Luci filius, consul tertium fecit. Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, made this building when consul for the third time. The name dativus is a calque of dotike, meaning the case of giving, though in actuality, the giving pertains to what the subject is doing. The indirect object, in the dative case, is in fact receiving. Still, the name gets the point across. The casus accusativus is a calque of ptosis aetiatike, and here Allen and Brink again believe that this is a mistranslation of the concept of aetia, which is cause as well as guilt. Thus, instead of accusativus, perhaps causativus would have been better, they think, as the direct object in the accusative case is caused to do something by most transitive verbs. And even some ancient Roman grammarians used causativus as an alternative name for accusativus, though this was kind of rare. The ablative case comes from aufero, auferre, abstuli, ablatum, to carry away, which works well for the preposition ab. Aburbe Roma, ad patria mea redeo. I returned to my homeland from the city of Rome. While the Greek localistic notion of genitive, dative, accusative for from, in, towards is not the same in Latin, the same concepts are contained in dative, accusative, ablative, for, towards, from. And the genitive in second position is such a valuable concept since it denotes parental lineage and possession. Another hypothesis for the sequence of cases, other than the localistic theory, popularized by Herman in his 1938 paper, but also suggested by ancient grammarians, says that the traditional order comes from the common order of cases in a majority of sentences. For example, Ptolemaios olago toyoioi tenarchen paredoken. As for the vocative case, this is the case used for addressing someone. Salve brute, vale gai. In Latin, the only native words that show vocative are the ones of the second declension that end with us or ius. In Greek, the vocative can occur in any of the declensions, and for masculine and feminine nouns. Since vocative is rarely different from the nominative, however, the traditional order leaves it at the bottom of the paradigm, which is convenient because that way it can be omitted without disturbing the sequence of the other cases. Occasionally, the ancient Romans would place the ablative after the vocative, making their Latin paradigms that much more similar to the Greek ones. But since disrupting the flow of the order of cases for the regular omission of the vocative interferes with recall, the vocative final position has prevailed from antiquity to the present day. Whatever its original purpose, we could simply justify the traditional order, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, plus the ablative in Latin, as acceptable merely because it's been around for millennia. But that would be argumentum ad antiquitate, the logical fallacy of appeal to antiquity or tradition. However, there are some people that use a different order of the cases in the declensions. Instead of nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, vocative usually we throw out at the end, they do nominative, accusative, and then vocative, and then after they'll throw in the dative and the genitive. Now, why would someone do that? Why would they do rosa, rosam, and then rosa, rosai, rosai? Well, I guess what you can see here is that we have what's called syncretism. The first few forms, rosa, rosam, and rosa, are relatively similar looking, and rosai and rosai, the genitive and the dative, they happen to be identical. So the logic with this new kind of order of the cases in the declensions is to help the student see the similarities, see the syncretism within the declension. The term syncretism has this really cool etymology. The root is actually Crete, Crete. It's from the joining together of the cities on that island into the Cretan.
Okay, first of all, it's Crete.
Federation, Syncretismos. And in linguistics, syncretism is the fusion of different inflectional forms, such as how the genitive and dative of rosa are spelled and sound the same, rosai, rosai. In the plural, the syncretic forms of this paradigm are the dative and ablative, rosis and rosis. Well, that's the first declension. What about the second declension, masculine? Here, the syncretic forms are the genitive singular and the nominative plural, lupi, lupi, just like rosai, rosai in the first declension. This happens to be the same syncretism in English, roses, roses. The other syncretisms are the dative and ablative, both singular and plural. In the neuter, as with Saxum, the nominative and accusative are also identical in the singular and plural. It's this syncretism that has inspired a few philologists, originally popularized by Danish scholar Rasmus Christian Rask in the 19th century, to change the sequence of cases in Latin to something more syncretic: nominative, accusative, dative, ablative, genitive. Here's what the three nouns we saw above look like in Rask's ordering. For the sake of comparison, here is the traditional order. Rask attempts to justify this order based on its being more similar to nature, he says. That is, the natural order, rather than an arbitrary one. Why natural? He argues that the more fundamental cases are at the top, and that the rest derive from the nominative. But morphologically, that doesn't seem to be true. In both Latin and ancient Greek, the nominative of many nouns and adjectives can be understood as the root which appears more plainly in the accusative form, plus an S or a sigma that marks the nominative. This is clearly illustrated in mega, the accusative and the nominative of the adjective for big in the neuter. This is the most fundamental form. To this we add a sigma to get the nominative of the masculine, megas. We can also see this in the adjective sopron, prudent, whose neuter accusative and nominative, philologists sometimes like to call this syncretic pair the direct case, is sopron. Here is the declension in the singular. In nouns and adjectives of this type, the non-neuter has a lengthened vowel to indicate the nominative, sopron, from a more fundamental sopron. Thus, we can conclude that the fundamental form is actually the accusative, and that the neuter should precede the nominative, if we were to follow the naturalistic order. Some in the 19th century actually took Rask's principles to this extreme, and thus we would expect these paradigms. Here's what those Latin paradigms look like with this supposedly very naturalistic sequence. This order of the cases doesn't appear to have ever caught on, but it hasn't stopped others in the 19th and 20th centuries from proposing other syncretic orders. Here are some of them. Many have encouraged the adoption of these various Nouveau sequencings of the cases based on naturalistic arguments, like those of Rask. But ultimately, these naturalistic arguments are half-hearted, as we've seen above, since a truly natural order, based on the growth of the paradigm from simpler to more complex forms, would have to place the accusative, and also the neuter, first. But how important is this to what we need the paradigms for in Latin and Ancient Greek? Does the case sequence really need to be based on the received morphology and theoretical morphology of Proto-Indo-European? Then there's Sanskrit. The traditional order of Sanskrit is close to the sequence that was proposed by Rask, and that's probably why he proposed it, to bring Latin and Greek in line with Sanskrit. But is that really a good reason to change the classical sequence of cases for Latin and Greek? Oh yeah, I forgot about the vocative. So, the vocative, which is frequently the same as the nominative in Greek and nearly always the same as the nominative in Latin, gets placed towards the top. And here with a similar set of words in Ancient Greek. But Greek has a lot more variety going on in its three declensions. In the first declension, for example, there's lots of masculine nouns, like the word for student. So the problem with listing the vocative in second position is that it tends to ruin the very syncretism that the syncretists, I'll call them syncretists for lack of a better term, so putting the vocative second messes up the very syncretism that the syncretists wish to emphasize, even in Latin. Thus the alternative order to the alternative order places the accusative second, emphasizing the key syncretisms, keeping the vocative in the third position. Of course, this is problematic too, since now the syncretisms of the nominative and the vocative, such as in rosa rosa, lupi lupi, are now blocked. So, alright, let's keep the vocative under the nominative. Okay, we'll live without the non-syncretic pairings in this syncretic order, somewhat syncretic order. Also, let's bring the genitive above the dative, since having the dative follow the genitive makes the sequence a bit more similar to the traditional order. And this is the order that seems most prevalent in England today.
Now, I don't like this newfangled pattern for a few reasons. One is purely subjective. People that learn the more syncretic version of the declension, they'll associate that as the better one because that's what they're familiar with. They would have had to do lots of work to memorize all of the declensions in that order, so that's the logic that makes sense to them. Whereas others, like myself, who use nominative genitive instead of the nominative accusative, we are used to that. So there's always going to be a subjective preference, just like some people prefer ecclesiastical pronunciation or classical pronunciation because they're used to one or the other. That's entirely natural and perfectly valid from a subjective point of view.
But other than its familiarity to those who use a syncretic order, is there any other reason to sequence the declension in a particular way? Some in favor of a more syncretist or supposedly naturalistic paradigm invoke the order in which one teaches the cases in context to students. And thus nominative followed by accusative makes sense for a lot of input-based approaches. But the order in which we teach the cases is not why the cases are arrayed as they are in the declension. Or should it be? Still, attempting to follow this idea of naturalism, scholars have come up with numerous patterns, competing for most natural, instead of just one. The goals of the syncretists seem to be at odds. Aligning the cases according to the order in which they are theoretically learned about in context doesn't work if you want to favor syncretic forms. Where the vocative goes is just one of the problems that arises from this conflict. So given the lack of consensus, which of the Nouveau orders is best connected to morphology and etymology, the theoretical, to say nothing of which order the cases ought to be taught in, let's look instead at the really practical reason for having a certain order of the cases. After all, what does it matter what way we sequence the list of cases? I believe the key reasons are these three in order of importance. Memorization, which is what we have to do as beginners, and occasionally at the intermediate and advanced level when we learn a new noun or adjective, especially if it's quite irregular. Recognition, such as the term as listed in a dictionary or an index. Discussion, in teaching the language in the classroom. Professor, is that ficus fici fico or ficus ficus fiqui? Or conversation among academics where interesting or unique forms of nouns are presented. Thus the sequence of cases is a shorthand for clear communication, just like alphabetical order. Of these three key reasons, let's start with memorization.
Now, the syncretic pattern seems to make things easier, but it only works for the first and the second declension. When you get to other declensions, the syncretism isn't as obviously there.
In the textbooks that employ a syncretic type paradigm, there are so many different patterns that you can find that this would get quite confusing if we examine them all. So let's just look at a syncretic pattern that has been common in the UK for the past century or so, starting with the first two declensions. The syncretist argument is that this is easier to memorize because these forms are identical. How does this go in the third declension? Well, here are some example nouns, except this isn't the actual set of paradigms in Classical Latin. In Classical Latin, in the strictest sense, meaning the Latin of the 1st century BC, leading up to the time just prior to the death of Augustus in the early 1st century AD, this is the pattern. See what's different? In what are called the I-stem nouns of the third declension, like ois and navis, the accusative plural is actually ois and navis. This can be seen frequently in Virgil among other authors of the period. Through analogy with non-I-stem nouns like leo, the later accusative plural became oes and naves. And this is what's taught as standard in most textbooks, but this textbook Latin is not representative of the truly core classical Latin. Thus, the point of syncretic order to place the supposedly similar accusative forms next to the nominative forms doesn't work for the third declension at all. The dative and ablative plurals are still the same, but that's always true. I'm not sure a syncretic order is necessary to ingrain that fact. Let's see these three nouns again in the traditional order. Here we see a true syncretism appears, a very important one. While most third declension nouns have a different form in the genitive, a great many do have identical nominative and genitive forms, at a rate that outnumbers the syncretic forms of the nominative and accusative in every other declension, especially masculine and feminine. Is one form of syncretism better than another? It certainly makes ois ois stand out from leo leonis and helps us to remember this really key fact of the paradigm. And note how I just gave the identity of the noun like that. Ois ois, leo leonis.
One of the biggest advantages, though, to the old-fashioned pattern of doing nominative genitive is that's exactly how words are listed in the dictionary. Nouns are always listed in their nominative and then genitive form in any dictionary of Latin, and also goes for ancient Greek. So when we learn rosa rosai, filius filii, well, we just have to look that up in a dictionary and we see the exact same pattern. That's in fact the reason why the genitive is right after the nominative, because it's part of the declension that we've already memorized. And there's another reason that the genitive is put there. With the nominative and the genitive, if we know the declensions, we can instantly know all of the rest of the forms in all of the paradigm. Well, with the nominative and the accusative, take genus. Well, let's just genus again. But with the genitive, we get generis. And with that ER, we can see the rest of the whole paradigm. But with the accusative, we don't get that.
So I argue that associating the noun paradigm with this universal dictionary form, both in Latin and Greek, is far more important than placing syncretic forms next to each other. Again, we're talking about how best to aid the beginner, right? For the beginner, the nominative-genitive order of the paradigm creates a reciprocal relationship between declension and dictionary term, and I think this is really valuable. Let's recall the second reason about why we should care that we named above. Recognition of the identity of the noun's paradigm. Every reference book on Latin and Greek gives the identity of the noun as nominative followed by genitive. And why? Well, it turns out, if you know the generalized pattern of a declension, say the second declension, you can easily work out the whole paradigm of another noun of that declension based only on the nominative and the genitive forms alone. We saw lupus lupi earlier, so we know that it's a second declension noun. If we are then given amicus amici, we would know right away it's a noun just like lupus lupi, second declension masculine, and we could easily complete the paradigm in the traditional order like this. Amicus, amici, amico, amicum, amico, etc. Now let's imagine we're trained in the syncretic pattern, and we're given the first two parts of the declension of this word, manus manum. We wouldn't know whether this noun were of the second declension, like lupus and amicus, or that, well, in fact, its real declension is the fourth declension, not the second, and that means it'll have a very different paradigm. That's why the dictionary lists nominative singular followed by genitive singular, and not followed by accusative singular, because one of these is useful and the other is not to figuring out the rest. And this pushes me towards favoring the traditional order. Now, you say you don't give a flying fig. Well, maybe we should give a fig, because this problem occurs again with the word for fig in Latin. If we're given the nominative and accusative, ficus ficum, we have no idea if it's ficus fici or ficus ficus. The fun thing for this one is it's actually both. The ancients themselves debated which declension this noun belonged to, and the reality is that some forms are used from one paradigm and some for others, depending on the case and the number, so that's fun. Now, according to the syncretist argument, one of the reasons for placing the accusative right below the nominative in the declension, or below the vocative when they want to write it, is that the accusative is more important. But is it really? The traditional pattern of nominative genitive has in its favor the affinity with the dictionary form, like we said, and this is something conceded by those who favor a syncretist pattern of the paradigm, including Allen and Brink, that paper I keep mentioning. So the nominative and the genitive really are the most important. If we use something like genus, we have genus genus, or genus genus genus, and then finally generis. Okay, I mean, that's fine. You have to memorize the whole thing, but, you know, why not just use the traditional order and then you get the most important thing to learn, which is the genitive. And given this universal agreement of the nominative-genitive pairing, at least in the dictionary form, in order to figure out the whole declension, the logic of the traditional pattern is that memorizing the declension nominative-genitive first makes it that much easier to recall the other forms spontaneously and the whole paradigm. Is this a strong argument? Well, let's see if we can examine it a little bit. With my own anecdotal experience, I remember when I was memorizing the declensions and I felt, wow, this is so useful having the nominative and genitive like this, not just because I can look it up in the dictionary this way, but because going from nominative followed by genitive, I can then, see how the rest of the paradigm works instantly, rather than having to work my way through several cases up to the genitive, the way it is in, say, the UK's syncretic pattern. But I'd like to concede to the syncretists that, as useful as a traditional order may be, or certainly I felt it was to me, we have to know the whole paradigm to begin with, just like we have to know all the letters of the alphabet to be able to read, not just some. So the relative importance of nominative and genitive is greatly reduced if we don't know how to decline each type of noun. Therefore, we really have to drill down on memorization and what might best aid the beginner student. So how does a student go about learning the declensions? The beginner may memorize declensions before learning anything else about the vocabulary or grammar and context, and this is the Dowling method, and I've talked about that in this video and in my audiobook. Or the beginner can commit to memory the declension after having seen at least all parts of the declension one time in context or in example texts. Or if the instructor is using a yet more input-based method, the beginner may be immersed in sentences, learning vocabulary and comprehending meanings of phrases from context, but not yet learning the declensions, until finally, after completing some beginner phase of learning all this vocabulary, they finally are directed to commit to memory the pattern of the declensions, to wrap it all up in a neat bow. All of these methods can work. I've used each one of them as a teacher. Certain students thrive with certain methods, but ultimately the declensions must be memorized. So does a syncretic pattern aid memorization? The syncretists seem to think so. They say placing similar or identical forms in proximity helps to remember them. To that I say, why exactly? We have to memorize not just part of the paradigm, but the whole paradigm, right? Just as it doesn't do any good to learn only the first 10 letters of the alphabet, why is it better to have the syncretic order for memorizing the entire declension? So here again is rosa, rosai in the syncretic order, common in Britain. In this pattern, we have the genitive and the dative, rosai, rosai, next to each other, but of course that's the same in the traditional order. The syncretism is mainly between the nominative and the vocative, which, like we talked about earlier, is almost always identical. Indeed, because the vocative is so frequently identical to the nominative, it's often left out of the paradigms, in both the traditional and the Nouveau order. Here's a photo I took from the back of my old copy of Wheelock's Latin, which has the traditional order. The vocative doesn't appear in any of the paradigms. Instead, a simple footnote clarifies that the only vocative forms of native Latin words occur in second declension nouns that end in us and also eus. I say native words in Latin because Greek words borrowed into Latin can show the Greek vocative sometimes. And here's the chart of declensions from the back of my original Copia Familia Romana circa 2005, which presents the syncretic order. Same thing, no vocative, not even a footnote. But that's fine, since the vocative is really just a special case of second declension nouns that end in us. Well, what about Greek? While the original British Athenaze actually uses the traditional order, the Italian edition, in Italy, the English order, the British order of the cases is quite rare. The Italian edition of Athenaze, nevertheless, has the Nouveau order, probably to bring it in line with Familia Romana, which is that way because, of course, Familia Romana was written by a Dane, and the Danes and the English have this Nouveau order of the cases in common. Anyway, the vocative is omitted in the back of Athenaze when it's the same as the nominative, but the vocative is presented when there is a difference between the vocative and the nominative. Unlike Latin, the Greek vocative differs from the nominative quite a lot, and in every declension. Thus, the vocative needs to be mentioned much more often. But does it need to be mentioned in every paradigm? The editors of this edition of Athenaze didn't think so. And this hiding of certain cases seems to be the norm for most of the grammars and the textbooks that favor the syncretic order in their presentation of the cases. They'll collapse cases together wherever possible, omitting any mention of the vocative, like this: saxum, saxum, saxi, saxo, saxo. Or even like this: saxum, saxi, saxo, saxo. Or even just this: saxum, saxi, saxo. While this paradigm can be simplified in this way, does this really help us memorize all the declensions? This simplified three-case presentation works for the second declension neuters, but what about third declension neuters? Here's the word for body: corpus, 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 corporis, corpori, corpore. We could simplify it like this: nominative, vocative, and accusative together as corpus, and corporis, corpori, corpore. The dative and the ablative can't be syncretized in every declension, even for neuter nouns. Oh, but we can do it for second declension masculine. Instead of lupus, lupe, lupum, lupi, lupo, lupo, we can do lupus, lupe, lupum, lupi, lupo. Now, while it definitely saves ink, this collapsing of the paradigms according to syncretic forms, which is different for every declension, it creates a big problem for memorization. When we memorize a paradigm, we're memorizing variables in a matrix, singular, plural, and using the UK pattern, nominative, vocative, accusative, genitive, dative, ablative, right? The memorization goes in a certain order. But the syncretist books and teachers are implicitly and sometimes explicitly telling students to ignore one or more key variables in the equation.
The great Oz has spoken. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Each case holds important information, while the traditionalists are content with placing the vocative at the end where it can be easily left off, causing no disruption to the rhythm of the chant. Lupus, lupi, lupo, lupum, lupo, lupe. And we have, of course, the first declension, rosa, rosai, rosai, rosam, rosa. And then we can leave off the vocative there. The point is that we have a one-to-one correspondence for every one of the cases, every one of the words in order, and the ending can be left off. That's why it's at the end. But in the partially collapsed syncretic pattern, where the second case is either vocative or accusative, is it really helpful to take away one of the key steps? So lupus, lupe, lupum, lupi, lupo, lupo, but rosa, rosam, rosai, rosai, rosa. So the second thing in the rosa is the accusative here. Oh wait, no, it should be rosa, rosa, rosam, rosai, rosai, rosa. And that way we have the correspondence, but then the syncretists like to collapse it. So I don't get this. The latter lines up with the lupus sequence while the other does not. My best assessment is that it seems that the Syncretists, loving their students and loving Latin and Greek and wanting to transmit these languages to them in the best way possible, have invented a simplification that actually creates stumbling blocks on the path to mastery of the fundamentals.
An advantage to the non-syncretic, old-fashioned pattern is that when you have to repeat forms that are similar, like if we, for example, if we put vocative at the very bottom instead of before the ablative, we actually see rosa, and then we have to finish with rosa, so that allows for a repetition. It's like a circle that closes back on itself. And the syncretic version doesn't allow for that.
So by using the traditional pattern, we actually create a kind of spaced repetition. Spaced repetition, you might have heard of this. Anki is one of those famous programs. It's a memorization technique where easily recalled information is delayed, and then newer, more difficult information is interspersed in between the repetition of the more easily recalled information, thus allowing us to memorize the whole set of things that we're trying to commit to memory much more effectively and much more easily, especially in the long term. Here again is saxum in the traditional order to demonstrate this principle. Saxum, saxi, saxo, saxum, saxo, saxum. In the plural, saxa, saxorum, saxis, saxa, saxis, saxa. Now both the singular and the plural are bookended by the same forms, the nominative and the vocative. This really helps to tie everything together, repeating the core identity of the noun, its nominative form, which is identical to the vocative in the neuter. Thus, we learn that rule this way, rather than in the syncretic way. And since it's a neuter noun, the nominative and the vocative are also the same as the accusative. This is very helpful. Now we have a very stable framework to expect, like the chorus of a song, within which we populate the other forms, the other verses of the song. And also like the repeating pattern of a song, saxo, saxum, saxo, saxi, saxa, saxis, they also repeat. Syncretists seem to think that these patterns are obscured by the traditional order of the cases, but it's the opposite. The repetition here is much more musical, akin to the rhyme scheme A-B-A-B. Now, there's nothing wrong with a simpler rhyme scheme of A-A-B-B, but songs tend to prefer A-B-A-B, definitely because the pattern is catchier, and because it's catchier and has an interwoven character, it's easier to remember a longer series of verses. If you keep the vocative at the end, well, this makes a different form a real shock. And that's a good thing because we want the student to really notice that. Lupus, lupi, lupo, lupum, lupo, lupe. Whoa. Whoa. That's pretty shocking. So it'll stand out, as it should. Alternatively, we could also leave the vocative out, wherever it's identical to the nominative, as our default mode. So here's saxum, saxi, saxo, saxum, saxo, and then lupus, lupi, lupo, lupum, lupo, lupe. Whoa, that's something different. This makes the pedagogical utility of the traditional order extremely high. In the case of lupus, that ends with lupe, something different from the nominative, it's like ending a song on a high note. It stands out and it's memorable, whereas the normal pattern that saxum represents, its initial chorus and its final chorus are the same, like so many songs do. However, it's really jarring when a measure, a beat, a verse is omitted or jammed in early in the song where it normally doesn't occur. Pick one. The W. Sidney Allen and C.O. Brink paper from 1979 that I keep bringing up, which covers the history of the order of the cases in Latin and Greek declensions, is actually an attempt by Allen and Brink, who were British, to argue that in this matter the new order has solid advantages, both theoretical and practical, over the old. Now, when I started my research for this video, I was actually quite open to showing why the new order is indeed better in some areas. So I was happy to find Allen and Brink's paper so I could tell my audience why the Nouveau order exists and what its strengths are. However, Allen and Brink don't actually make any attempt to explain why the syncretic pattern is better, except for a quote that we'll look at in a bit, and seem to leave it as self-evident that placing identical forms next to each other is just better. But again, I ask, why? Why is it better to have the accusative and nominative neuters next to each other to show their identical spelling when this rule is plainly obvious in the traditional paradigm? This is the quote that stood out to me. Thus, the traditional order will link the nominative and the genitive in the mind of the learner, and later the scholar, just as it will link the accusative with the oblique cases between which it occurs. This is utter nonsense. The affinity between nominative and accusative is not only plainly visible to anyone, whether they learn Latin with the traditional order or not, especially in the neuter, since the accusative there, being identical to the nominative, is the most universal rule in both Latin and Greek and all declensions and paradigms. The order that the cases are memorized in doesn't bias me to think that the accusative is more akin to the dative or the ablative. Just as the fact that D, E, and F are next to each other in the alphabet doesn't make me think that E has more in common with D or F, which are consonants, rather than the vowels, A, I, O, and U. And if the similarities or identical forms, putting them together is so important, why do syncretists readily collapse these identical forms into one, thus obscuring the very thing they said they wanted to emphasize? A new order, to be of worth to the student, needs to compete with the old order by these three criteria that we established earlier. Memorization. Does it help the beginner commit the paradigms to memory? Recognition. Does the student notice the key differences and similarities between paradigms? And discussion. Is class or academic conversation improved? The version of the syncretic order common in the UK that Allen and Brink espouse doesn't seem to be advantageous for memorization, although I definitely find this to be the least offensive of the possibilities because it's essentially just moving the accusative up below the nominative, as long as you don't include the vocative, in which case it just becomes irritating because it's not consistent, but we already talked about that. Whatever dubious benefit is gained by placing these syncretic forms next to each other is thwarted by the half-hearted omission or inclusion of the vocative, interrupting the sequence, interrupting the memorization pattern. Now, the recognition of the dictionary form that's built into the traditional order, well, that link is broken in the syncretic order. And since vocative and occasionally accusative are both listed as one form with the nominative, the cross-declension recognition is also degraded, since you have to kind of expand something that's been collapsed for, I can only imagine, for the purpose of saving ink. Finally, if a student raises his hand and asks, is it manus mani or manus manus, the elegance of this shorthand is much clearer than asking, is it manus manus manum manus? Now, I grant a lot of this is really minor, and it always was, which is why I think it's odd that the syncretists really tried to espouse this idea to begin with. Of the three criteria, only memorization is truly important. After memorization is complete and we are reading texts in Latin or Greek, we will encounter the cases in any conceivable order. We need to know all of them. Alphabetical order is equally irrelevant when we're actually reading, right? Its only further use is to look up terms in the dictionary. And in any case, we're all capable of memorizing a list of items in virtually any order. Whether the syncretic forms are next to each other or not, it might make it easier, or it might not. It's going to be a really small difference either way. It seems to me that the very thing that syncretists opine is the reason that makes the syncretic order less useful. The syncretist thesis is that it's better to have nominative and accusative, or I suppose nominative, vocative, accusative, next to each other because it shows these similarities. I think the spaced repetition that's built into the traditional order is probably better for memorization, but that's fine. But then they take out the vocative wherever possible, or collapse the paradigm in other ways. These are problems. Are these problems insuperable? Not at all. They're pretty tiny. But for every hypothetical problem that is supposedly solved by the nominative accusative order, right, I mean, of course, the nominative vocative accusative order, another is created. Argumento ad antiquitatem is a logical fallacy, but parallel to it is an old adage. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. In 20 years of teaching Latin, I've never once seen a student struggle with the traditional order of cases. This is, admittedly, entirely anecdotal. It's probably also true that teachers using one of the Nouveau orders have never seen their students struggle with this sequence of cases that they're using. Now, I welcome you to share your anecdotal experiences in the comments as students and teachers, because I'd really like to hear from you. A lot of this is just my opinion, and I can't say I'm any less biased than Allen and Brink, who were educated in a certain system, and they want to prove the legitimacy of that system in ways that I think don't measure up. I'm sure I'm guilty of the same thing, so I definitely want to hear from you. And in any case, whatever advantages or disadvantages might exist in either pattern, they're so small and so quickly overcome that this really isn't much of a debate, and I'm fine with that. It's only become a debate in academia because some well-intentioned scholars, especially in the 19th century, saw a problem where none existed and imposed a solution that I don't think really solved anything.
So my belief and opinion about this is that this old-fashioned order of nominative and then genitive, it just gives so much more information. That's why it's like that in the dictionary. And if when memorizing these paradigms, we remember best the first elements of it, that's probably more valuable than just having the accusative, which half the time might be identical or very similar and not tell us enough information. However, if you're used to the Nouveau syncretic forms, then you should go ahead and keep on using those. That's fine. But if you have to make a choice of using the traditional pattern or using the syncretic one, for the reasons I already gave,
I recommend the old-fashioned one, the nominative genitive, and not the nominative accusative. But a lot of this comes down to subjective preference. If you are learning Latin and enjoying it, then I'm happy. Thanks so much for watching. Valete. Now the problem is that the genitive when we learn now if you've already learned Latin in the Nouveau way, then obviously you should stick with that. The only reason to switch and do the more traditional pattern is to irritate me. The only reason to use the traditional pattern would be to... These paradigms of nouns, adjectives, and pronouns are called declensions, from the Latin declinatio, meaning going downhill. What we do when we climbing the figurative hill of... Damn.